Okay, so our second speaker today is Dr. Douglas Tallamy, and he researches how plants that evolved elsewhere impact food webs and biodiversity. So how invasives are impacting our ecosystems. Tallamy speaks nationwide about the concerns that the approach to gardening must change. He contends the widespread planting of ornamental plants. And I put my glasses. Anyway. He contends the widespread planting of ornamental plants native to other parts of the world is creating ecosystem-wide problems. He's an author of the best-selling books, Nature's Best Hope and The Nature of Oaks, and Bringing Nature Home, How You Can Sustain Wildlife with Native Plants. He has been featured and interviewed by the New York Times, NPR, Associated Press, and various other outlets. And I know he's just gotten back from New Mexico, speaking there, and he's all over speaking in various places. He's been here many times to Maryland. He has started a movement called the Homegrown National Park, and I hope he can explain to us about that. Let us offer a warm welcome to Dr. Douglas Tallamy. We're welcome you here.
Well, thank you, Greg. It's a very big pleasure to be here today. I don't usually speak on a global stage. As a matter of fact, I never speak on a global stage, but we'll give it a try. Dr. Lau this morning certainly talked about the issues we have on planet Earth. There are many, they're serious. It can get pretty depressing. I'm going to focus on one of those, and that's really the biodiversity crisis. And maybe I'm a cockeyed optimistic or whatever that is. But I'm pretty optimistic that we can turn that around. It's going to take an army of private citizens to do it, but we have an army of private citizens to do it. So that is the major theme. It does focus, of course, on North America. So it's thinking locally, but the solution can easily go global. So how do we do conservation in our yards? Let's first talk about the late E.O. Wilson. He died the day after Christmas 2 years ago. It was a terrible loss to the world of conservation. He had an extremely long and successful career at Harvard. But one of the things that was consistent throughout his very long career was his love of life on planet Earth and his efforts to save it. He wanted to save it not just because he loved it, but because he knew it was essential to our own survival. So in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life, and he had one simple message. He said, if we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we're going to have to save nature. We're going to have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of the planet, or it will disappear everywhere. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that very bold statement. And by the way, when he says it will disappear, he's talking about humans too. So serious stuff. So he spent the book talking about the science that supports that statement, and then he ended the book. He didn't spend very much time telling us how we were going to save nature on half of planet Earth. Of course, to a conservation biologist, that's a good idea. We'll just put half the Earth aside, and everything that's in trouble can be in that half, and we can be in the other half, and it'll be great. But half of planet Earth is already in some form of agriculture. We've got that 8.1 billion people, and the other half. We don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So how can we realize E.O. Wilson's dream? Well, we need a new approach to conservation to do that. Nature is built from a series of very specialized interactions, largely between animals and plants. There are millions of them. So for example, you won't have acorn weevils if you don't have acorns, and you won't have acorns if you don't have oak trees. You won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have carpenter ants. And you won't have carpenter ants, because that's what they rear their young on, carpenter ants. And you won't have carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have Facilia. That is the only plant, the only pollen that bee can rear its young on. It turns out pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We've got between 3,600 and 4,000 species of native bees, and over a third of them can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plants. You won't have the Baltimore checker spot unless you have white turtle head. So specialization is really what makes nature happen. But many, unfortunately, most of these specialized interactions these days are in trouble. As a matter of fact, nature is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes largely because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon and he stood on the edge and he looked out over it and he said, "Leave it as it is." And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't leave most of the lower 48 states as it was. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 that's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And you know all the things that we've done to it. Edwin Wade Teal decades ago said we cannot make the world uninhabitable for other forms of life and have it habitable for ourselves. It's just common sense. We're very late off the blocks in terms of reacting to statements like that. So why have we done what we've done to the earth? I don't know, but I suspect that we thought that our nest, planet Earth, was so large we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. And of course, we were wrong about that, and we heard about a lot of those consequences this morning, but we are seeing headlines these days. It's now in the public sphere. Things like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's a third of our North American bird population already gone. The UN is predicting we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction in the next 20 years. And they did that 2 years ago, so now it's the next 18 years, I guess. That's a prediction. It hasn't happened yet, but we have to make sure it doesn't come to pass because those are the species that keep us alive on this planet. It is serious business. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, and as Shakespeare would say, upon all of our houses. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people like you and me, those efforts to deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, back to E.O. Wilson. He told us what would happen if insects disappeared from planet Earth. And he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And again, his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our vertebrate animals would collapse. Our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, and our mammals would all disappear. By the way, we're a mammal. The biosphere, the living portion of the Earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And again, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. There is good news. We're going to talk about good news, and that is that none of that has to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We're totally dependent on the life support that ecosystems provide. We call them ecosystem services. Top grouping there is just a few of the things that plants do every day that we depend on, like produce oxygen, pretty important, clean water. Plants are slowing the progress of water after it rains. It's all headed to the ocean. And once it gets to the ocean, it's too salty to use. So plants slow down that journey. They're capturing carbon, of course, and pumping that carbon into the ground. And once it's in the soil, it can be extremely stable as long as we don't disturb the soil. Plants are building topsoil, they're holding it in place, they're preventing floods, they're dampening severe weather, they're converting sunlight into food. If we lose our plants, we're going to have to eat sunlight. and then we will lose weight. What do animals do for plants? They provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. It never was a good idea, but today it's a terrible idea because of those 8 billion people that are demanding more and more ecosystem services every single day. And we do have parks and we do have preserves, and they're doing the best they can, but we are in the 6th great extinction event the planet has ever experienced. So it's obviously not good enough. I think the solution is to start to practice conservation outside of parks and preserves on landscapes just like that. And there have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. There have been indigenous groups that have been good at doing that for long periods, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, going to another place, doing the same thing, not sustainable behavior. But Aldo Leopold had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we could develop what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the land. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed we could learn to do them gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called the land ethic, and he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac, his most famous book. What he did not write about, though, was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot live together. We cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, it's still embedded in our own culture. He may not have recognized it as an option. But my message this afternoon is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. And that means we've got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, not get diminished every day, but thrive. Where should we start? Well, back to private property. What's outside of those parks and preserves? It's private property. 78% of the lower 48 states is privately owned. 85.6% east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we don't practice conservation on private property, we're going to fail, and failure is not an option. And we use the word conservation, not using exactly the way I mean. We do want to conserve any bits of nature that are left out there. That has been our conservation model for the last 100 years, and we want to keep doing that. But it's not working. There's not enough left out there. So we have to go beyond conservation into restoration. We have to rebuild the nature that we have destroyed in so many places. And somebody will say, well, no way you can put it back together again exactly the way it was. And they're probably correct, but we can reunite enough of those specialized interactions I talked about at the beginning of the talk to rebuild ecosystem function, even if it's not exactly what occurred on that space at some point in the past. But in order to do that, we have to start with the building blocks. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally, so we have to start with the most important groups. And there's 2 groups we can't do without. One is the flowering plants, and of course the pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce. They are capturing energy from the sun and through photosynthesis turning it into the food that supports just about all the animal life on the planet. So now we have the food that animals need tied up in plant tissues, mostly in leaves. If you don't get that food to animals, you don't have any animals. And if you don't have any animals, you don't have a functional ecosystem. Well, it turns out that most vertebrates don't eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat invertebrates that ate plants. Most of those invertebrates are insects, and not just any insect, caterpillars. Turn out to be enormously important in transferring energy from plants to animals. Caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other organisms than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, we have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. Let's use the Carolina chickadee as an example. That's the chickadee that occurs here, chickadee that occurs in my yard. They're at our feeder eating seeds all winter long. Most people think, well, that's what chickadees need. Well, only 50% of their diet is seeds, even in the wintertime. The other 50% is insects and spiders. And when they reproduce, their babies can't eat seeds at all. And that's true for most of the birds that are out there. They can't eat seeds, so they switch to invertebrates. And if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they are not alone. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. So why caterpillars? There's several things special about caterpillars. They're soft, so you can stuff them down the throat of your offspring without fear of hurting them. They're large, relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. They're nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin, of exoskeleton compared to other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are, I think of caterpillars as if they're little sausages. Beetles are like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible. And beetles have sharp edges too. It's hard to stuff them down the throat of your offspring. And caterpillars are also the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. So there's lots of research that are suggesting caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diets. They are essential parts of bird diets. So let's just say most birds need caterpillars. The next question is, how many do they need? Well, back to Carolina chickadees, a lot of data on Carolina chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of Carolina chickadees? Is one or two enough? Or one or two a day enough? It's a good question. But one or two is not enough, and one or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get one clutch of chickadees to the point where they leave the nest, where they fledge. And after they fledge, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. So you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars required to make one nest of a bird that's a third of an ounce. That's 4 pennies worth of bird. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, and I would think you do because in so many places that's all we have, is our yards, you've got to have all those caterpillars in your yard because the chickadee forage is about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And that's true for most birds. They're foraging next to the nest. And if we landscape in a way that does not include all of those caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is one of the major causes of the bird declines that people are measuring. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al. That's the Smithsonian group who said we've lost 3 billion breeding birds. And we divided our terrestrial bird species into 2 groups. The species that require insects. Let's see if I can do my idea there. That's that group. Particularly when they're breeding, and the species that do not require insects when they're breeding. So things like doves and finches and crossbills can actually make a little milk out of the seeds they eat, and they can rear their young on that. And look, the species that don't require insects didn't lose any numbers at all in the last 50 years. But the species that require insects lost, on average, 10 million individuals per species. It doesn't prove cause and effect, but it does suggest that as you take bird food away, you lose the birds. So I think we need to raise the bar about what we're asking our landscapes to do. In the past, we've asked them to do one thing, be pretty. Now we're going to ask them to do 2 things, be pretty and ecologically functional. And that's not going to happen if you don't put the caterpillars back into those landscapes. So how do you put caterpillars back in the landscapes? We add caterpillars by adding the plants that support those caterpillars, which seems pretty straightforward, but there is a catch, and that is that most plants do not support many caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about which plants we're landscaping with, and we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy. And the monarch butterfly illustrates that perfectly. It's not an exception. It's what most of the insects are doing. You can have all the calorie pears and all the barberry and all the privet and all of the burning bush and all of the things we typically landscape with in our yards, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly is one of the milkweeds. That's called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat particular plants. Sorry, I'm burping up my lunch here. So why is that? Why are most insects host plant specialists? Well, plants have made them that way. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world, which is why it's green out there. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. Thank you. But insects do eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants, so most of the insects that are eating plants can only eat particular plants. They can only eat the plants for which they have already evolved special adaptations that allow them to get around those chemical defenses. Specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. It takes a long period of interacting with those plant lineages for all those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect is locked into eating that particular plant. So if you take the milkweeds out of your yard and replace them with hostas or anything else, the monarch's not going to be able to start eating hostas. It has two choices. It can either fly away and find milkweed someplace else or starve to death. So it turns out there's three kinds of plants out there. There are plants that contribute energy to local food webs. There are plants that do not contribute energy to local food webs. And there's plants that actively remove energy from local food webs. The very best contributor in 84% of the counties in which they occur is one of our oaks. We have 91 species of oaks. And almost everywhere, there's at least one species that is there, and it's delivering more energy to other organisms than any other type of plant. A good example of a non-contributor would be ginkgo biloba from Asia. It's a nice ornamental plant, has good fall color, but nothing eats the ginkgo. So it's not adding any energy into a local food web. And a good example of a detractor would be any of the invasive plants, the plants that not only for them are they from another continent, they're not contributing energy, but they also don't stay where we plant them. This is calorie pear, and what happens? It escapes and is now a major component of our natural areas. And we have, I don't know, something like 300 or 400 million acres of this country saturated with the invasive plants we brought in as ornamentals. It's a serious, serious problem. I must be blocking this. So all I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. We are not going to rebuild functional ecosystems if you don't have functional food webs within those ecosystems. And that's not going to happen if we don't choose the right plants. And I'm going to give you a few examples of how well this works when we do choose the right plants, starting with my house, our house. My wife wants me to call it our house. She lives there too. We bought, it was 10 acres of a farm in Oxford, Pennsylvania that was broke up in the year 2000. Very old farm, been farmed almost 300 years. Last thing they did was mow it for hay. So there were very few plants there. And our job was to rebuild the ecosystem there, put it back together, which we had never done before. We didn't know what we were doing. One of the things I wanted to try, though, was to plant the host plant of a particular moth and see whether that moth would actually come and start to make a living at our house. So the first one I tried was the Canadian owlet. I'd never even seen a Canadian owlet before. It's a pretty little thing as a caterpillar. As an adult, looks like a leaf. Well, you're not going to have Canadian owlets unless you have its host plant, which is meadow rue. We didn't have any meadow rue. I'm sure there was meadow rue there 300 years ago before it was farmed to death, but the meadow rue was long gone. So I got some meadow rue seeds and I planted them, and they grew very nicely. This was early on, and I had very little faith that Canadian owlets would appear out of nowhere and colonize my little patch of meadow rue. So I didn't even go out and check it for at least 2 months after I planted it. But one day I was walking by for another reason and I looked over, it was covered with Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. Still impressed with that. So now we have a good population of Canadian owlets and meadow rue. We've added 2 species to that bare landscape. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. It's actually a misnomer. That beautiful moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on that plant, Biden's aristosa, ditch daisy. We didn't have any ditch daisy, but I did know where there were some Bidens growing in a power line cut about 14 miles away. So I got some seeds, planted them at home. They grew very nicely. As a matter of fact, I took over my front yard last year. That's okay. I had to wait a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my patch of goldenrod Bidens, but they did, and now we got a good population of both of those. So now we've added 4 species to the property, and we did that over and over and over again until our property was pretty well vegetated. We're still adding plants. Plants grow, you know, it's easier than you think. Now, my research has shown over the years that if you know the number of species of moths, not butterflies, butterflies are bad tasting day flying moths. They really are. So that's why they get to fly during the day. They don't taste very good. Nothing wants to eat them. So if you know the number of species of moths that really drive the food web, you have a very good index of how productive that food web is and how stable it is. So for the last 7 years, I have been taking pictures of every moth species I could find on our property. I am still at it, but I'm up to 1,288 species that have colonized our house because we put the plants back. I hope you're clapping for the plants because now we have 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 22.9 million acres, I believe, something like that. So in one tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of Pennsylvania, we have 48% of all the moth species that occur in the state because we put the plants back. And because so many of those are types of bird food, we have recorded 62 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Not flew by, but bred. Why am I telling you this? Almost every day, the World Wildlife Fund says that Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. It's a terrible statistic. I'm thinking, gee, not at our house. I'm convinced we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3. It didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back. What would happen if everybody put the plants back? We really could turn this around. Will it work on smaller properties, though? Good question. Let's go to Margie and Dan Terpster's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. They're in the middle of a development. Everybody around them has the big lawns. When they moved into their yard, it was choked with Amur honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle, another invasive plant. So they got rid of that. They planted 70 species of native plants, put in a water feature that they call a bubbler, and then they started to count the birds that are using their yard, and they're up to 155 bird species, including 35 warbler species, an incredible number. What about urban yards? Will it work there? You know, 82% of us live in cities. Well, let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. She's got 1/10 of an acre. That's 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. She abuts O'Hare Airport, so she really is in Chicago. She's not connected to any natural area at all. She's a tiny little island. It's a pretty island because Pam is a native plant landscaper and she knows what she's doing. But she got rid of her non-native plants. She put in 60 species of native plants, and then she sat back and started to count the birds using her yard. She's up to 127 bird species that have used her yard, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago. And even if you don't have any property at all, but you have a balcony, and you know, if you live in an apartment complex, that's a lot of people. You can do productive native plant gardening in containers. And let's see, yeah. So there's a typical apartment complex. It's a pile of bricks, totally dead. Let's put some plants on all of those balconies. All of a sudden, it becomes a living resource for pollinators, the migrating monarch, even in the middle of a city. So there's 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way, and we want to succeed in a big way. And one of the things is we've got to talk about those big lawns. We have 44 million acres of lawn in this country. I don't know what the figures are in the rest of the world, but that's enough for right here. That's a size bigger than New England dedicated to an ecological deadscape. Why do we do that? Well, it's a status symbol. It's neat. We like neat. But what if we cut the area of lawn in half? So let's make the math simple. Let's say we've got 40 million acres. We're going to cut that in half. That will give us 20 million acres that we can restore right at home, which is the land we're going to make Homegrown National Park out of. And it'll be big. It'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. If you add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park will be the biggest park in the country. It's a real thing. You can go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, register your property on the map, and put in the amount of area you're going to be a good steward of. Maybe you really are going to cut your area of lawn in half. Maybe you're going to plant an oak tree. Maybe you're going to put an aster in a flower pot. It all counts. Then your little piece of your county is going to light up with a firefly. And of course, the object is to get the entire country to light up. Our mission is very simple. We want to motivate millions of people to regenerate biodiversity with the native plants that support that biodiversity, remove the invasive species that do not support that biodiversity, and in so doing, build a culture that is sympathetic to the needs of conservation. We have real ecological products, significant increase in biodiversity. And if I look at what's happened at our house, it just emphasizes nature is really resilient. If you put those plants back, it will rebuild itself. A measurable reduction in invasive species. If everybody got rid of the invasive plants just on their property, we'd be 78% done, 85% done in the East. That's a very good first step. Significant drawdown of atmospheric CO2. Lawn is the very worst plant for sequestering carbon. If you replace it with anything else, you're going to help climate change. And we're going to start to build viable habitat outside of parks and preserves. And every bit of conservation we do outside of a park helps conservation inside of the park. There are also sociological products of Homegrown National Park, too, very important ones. National awareness, not just of what the problems are, but what the solutions are and what our roles in those solutions are. We do want to change the culture. We want people to realize that nature's not optional. It's not there for our entertainment. It's essential for everybody. And because it's essential for everybody, everybody owns responsibility to taking care of it. We want to convert hope into action. Hope is good, but action's even better. And we want to merge all the existing conservation organizations like Audubon and National Wildlife Federation, Sierra Club, Wild Ones, all those into one visual on the map, the biodiversity map. We don't charge. Homegrown National Park is free. So we're not pulling membership away from anybody else, but we want to record all the successful conservation that is happening on private property. You know, the 30 by 30 initiative, we're going to save 30% of US by 2030, not if we don't count conservation on private property. So what plants should we put in the area that we remove lawn from? I'm going to argue that some of them have to be what I'm calling keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is. It is the stone in the middle of the Roman arch. And if you take that stone out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because they are making most of the food. Just 14% of our native plants are supporting 90% of the caterpillars that drive those food webs. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that hold that house up. They are essential. They're the support system. We cannot build a house out of wallpaper. And that's what we've been trying to do for the last 100 years. Oaks are the #1 keystone plant around the country. In the mid-Atlantic states here, they support 557 species of caterpillars. Tulip trees, good native trees, they support 21. So there's tremendous difference among our native plants. We have to use the most powerful ones, or at least make sure they are included. Oaks are supporting more than 950 species of caterpillars around the country. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to use keystone plants. We're going to invite a lot of insects into our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which is not the goal. Turns out that light pollution is one of the major causes of insect declines. And those are all the ways that lights are killing our insects, particularly the moths that make the caterpillars that run our food webs. This is good news to me. It's good news because we have to turn around, not just stop, but we've got to reverse insect declines. Last figure I saw was we've lost 75% of the insects on the planet, the little things that run the world. Not good. If we can turn that around by flicking a switch, we're getting off easy. There are a lot of switches to flick out there, but there's a lot of us to do that. But right away, somebody's going to say, well, I can't turn the light out over my barn or over my garage or my front porch because the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on it so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And you will notice right away the bad man does not come right away very often. The easier is to take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. Yellow wavelengths do not attract nocturnal insects. If we were to switch out our white bulbs for yellow bulbs overnight, we would save millions of insects. And if we use yellow LEDs, we'd save millions of dollars too. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to use keystone plants. We're going to modify our light system, and then we're going to invite Mosquito Joe to come kill all our insects. This is a booming business around the country. And they say it's okay because what we're fogging with is a natural product. And it is. It's pyrethroids from chrysanthemums. It's a natural organic product. Just like cyanide is a natural organic product, ricin is a natural organic product. So being natural and organic sounds warm and fuzzy, but maybe not. They also say it only kills mosquitoes. Not at all true. It kills all the insects it comes in contact with, including our beloved monarch. This is the result of a mosquito fogging event on Kent Island in the Chesapeake a couple of years ago. My friend happened to be there, and he picked up this handful of dead monarchs, but he said there were thousands on the ground. It was the middle of a big migration event. It's killing all of our pollinators. The interesting thing is it doesn't control mosquitoes. We're doing this for nothing. You don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. You have to kill 90% of them to get good control. These guys kill between 10 and 50%, so they have to keep coming back and back and back, making sure your monarchs are really dead. If you really want to control mosquitoes, do it through biological control with mosquito dunks. You get a bucket and you fill it full of water, and you put a handful of straw or hay or maybe some leaves in there. Put it out in the sun for a few days, and it builds up populations of diatoms and algae, and that is what mosquito larvae eat. So your female mosquitoes will lay their eggs in your bucket. It becomes an irresistible brew. Then you go to the hardware store and you buy a sheet of mosquito dunks. That's Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a natural bacterium that only kills aquatic diptera. And the only aquatic diptera in your bucket is the mosquito larva. So it's very targeted. You're not killing anything else. And it works, particularly if everybody did it. Okay, the fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows those all-important caterpillars to complete their development. And I'm really talking about what happens under our trees. So I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania. This is just an example where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete the development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon, hangs from one of the branches, then it emerges as an adult, and then it does it all over again. Everything happens on the tree. But most species don't do that. Most species grow as a caterpillar in the tree, and then they drop from the tree, and they pupate underground, they wiggle their way under the ground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it. It's messy. And we mow and compact the soil so that it's rock hard, very difficult for those caterpillars to get underground, which makes this an ecological trap. So the moths come in, they lay their eggs, caterpillars develop, they drop down and die. And of course, the cement landscape is not the answer either. This is what most people do. You got a tree in your yard. I have a grad student now who's measuring how well caterpillars do in a situation like that. But I guarantee they're going to do better in a situation like that. This is soft landing. Caterpillars fall out of the tree. The ground is not compacted. Nobody's mowing it. Nobody's going to step on them. Very much higher survivorship. This is where you can do your spring ephemeral gardening. This is how you shrink the lawn. You put big beds around your trees. The bigger, the better. If you have 3 or 4 trees in your yard and you put a bed out to the drip line, that takes away about 30% of your lawn right there. All you had to do was put a bed under your tree and you've got much higher caterpillar survivorship. Okay, so I think we've made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And the first one's really important. We're starting to think of nature as if it's optional. We like nature. We like to go bird watching. We like to take our hikes, but it's not essential. And if it's not essential, when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, nature takes a back seat. Of course, resources are always in short supply. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out. There's this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our society's view of conservation. We want to save nature, we want to save wildlife so that future generations can enjoy it. It was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for creating or expanding the national park system. Beautiful places, we want to save them so that future generations can enjoy it. And I get that because nature is enormously entertaining, but it is much more than that. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that the humans and nature cannot coexist. We talked about this, but if we restrict conservation just to the places where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail because those places are now too small, there's too few of them, and they're too isolated. David Quammen has a wonderful analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. That is a functional Persian rug. That's not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug, and that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. They don't like that language because it implies there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, even including much of our agriculture. So we need to glue our rug back together again, folks. We've got to put the plants back, not just to make biological corridors that connect isolated habitat fragments, but to recreate viable habitats in all those places we've destroyed them. The good news is it's starting to happen. It really is starting to happen. And when it does, it'll be the first time in modern history that humans have coexisted with the natural world. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, a few ecologists. For some reason, we did not see it as an inherent responsibility of everybody on the planet. But I don't know why, since every single person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of local ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody be in charge of taking care of those ecosystems? Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said, the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. Mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. We've been very good at teaching that, teaching about our rights, but we've been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have obligations to good earth stewardship. That does not mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save biodiversity where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. Now, more and more of us recognize the earth has some serious issues. But most people feel, what can one person do? Well, one person can do a lot. One person can shrink the lawn. One person can modify your lights. One person can add a pollinator garden. We didn't even talk about that. Remove your invasive plants. One person can use keystone plants. One person can fire a mosquito Joe. One person can do a whole bunch to revitalizing the ecosystem functionality right where they live and then enhance their local ecosystem instead of continuing to degrade it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. I mean, we do want to think globally, but don't get depressed over it. Just worry about the piece of the planet you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. They're all underfunded, they're all understaffed, so they'll love you as a volunteer. So as a property owner or a volunteer, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like that. whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Sit down or what?
Yeah, well, you can stay here, yeah. Yes, well, let's have another round of applause for Douglas Tallamy. Thank you very much. We love your message and how you're communicating with us. Now we have time for question and answers. So put out your questions and send them up, and we'll start asking them. Okay. Okay, here's one for you, Dr. Douglas. Have you used competitions to encourage more and better participation and awareness about the homegrown national park?
Well, if you picture that map again, the states were color-coded. The greener the state, the more participants. The yellower the state, the fewer participants. And this was suggested to us that people like competition. And they're right. You know, I show that slide and somebody says, we're not green enough. You know, we got to work harder. You know, so that's the end of that. No, that's our form of competition. States competing with each other, counties competing with each other, and it's all through the visuals on that map.
Okay. What is the best way to count and ID the number of caterpillar species on my oak tree?
Yeah, I hear all the time, well, I don't see any caterpillars on my oaks. You have to look at the right time of year. Looking at night with a flashlight is the best way. The caterpillars are hiding during the day. The birds are very good at finding them. The worst time to look is right now, because the birds are in the middle of reproduction or they finish reproducing, and they have eaten just about everything that's out there. So the end of July, early August around here is a very good time to look for caterpillars. And yeah, do it at night, little flashlight, because they come out and they're showing themselves.
As we know, invasive species are hard to get rid of. What's the best way to do that? We don't want to use Roundup, which is harmful, et cetera.
Well, we should stop selling them in our nurseries. That would be a good first step. Yeah, let's talk about herbicides for a few minutes. Life is full of trade-offs. When you get a tumor in your body, what do? We use chemotherapy. It is a poison to kill the tumor in our body. And the object is to use that poison exactly right so that you don't kill your body. You don't want to use too much. So herbicides are an effective tool in our fight against invasives. It's easy to misuse them. It's easy to overuse them. You don't have to use them depending on your situation. You can use a Matic, which whacks out the roots. But if, for a number of situations, if you don't kill the root system, it comes back and you never get rid of it. So herbicides is an effective tool. You just have to use them correctly. What I do, particularly for woody invasives, is to saw it off at the base and just paint the stump. You're using very little material then, and you do kill the root systems. I heard, one of our worst invasives here is Phragmites, the common reed. There's a place called Mentor Marsh in Mentor, Ohio. 800 acres. It was the largest Phragmites stand in Ohio. For 7 years, they treated it, and now I've got great pictures of it. It is a vibrant freshwater marsh. There's 2 endangered plant species that came back on their own because of the seed stock in there. Phragmites totally gone. It's actually the first time I've heard about Phragmites really being controlled, but it made a believer out of me. How did they do it? They sprayed from a helicopter. So an effective tool, but the benefits, in my view, outweigh the costs.
What did they spray it with?
I don't know what they sprayed it with.
Okay, here's another question. Where do you get native plant seeds from, and do you start native plant seeds indoors, or how?
The demand for native plants across the country exceeds the supply now. So finding local seed sources or plant sources is more of a challenge than it will be in the future. Are there any growers here? See, raise your hand, talk to these people. This is where you get it. When we moved into our property, the very first thing I did was plant oaks. What did I do? I went down the street and got acorns for free off the ground, and I put them in the ground. I put elm in our yard. I got elm seeds from a couple of big American elms in the University of Delaware property that didn't die from the Dutch elm disease. And I planted them. They germinate in 6 days. Today, those trees are over 80 feet tall. So, and again, free. You don't have to spend a lot of money. I guess you have to know somebody or know a little bit, but the supply is going to catch up with the demand. So be patient.
Do you believe that we should and can make this information part of a mandatory environmental science course for younger children's education? And how could we do that?
Yeah, I'd love to have it mandatory for everybody, not just younger children. I'd love to have it required course in every university. I don't know, people don't like mandates. They do like incentives. You know, along those lines, we rewrote Nature's Best Hope for maybe 5th to 7th graders. It's now available, $10 paperback. You can get that into the school system. It's got all the information that the original book has. It's just written in younger people's language. But it's a challenge. I hear all the time, let's get this message to the young people, and we do want to do that. But we can't wait another generation. The most powerful group right now in terms of conservation, at least in the US, is baby boomers, retired baby boomers. They have the money, they have the time, and they're looking for something to do. Our kids in school, they have the interest, they don't own property, they can talk to their parents. I don't want to minimize that, but we don't want to wait. We can't wait a generation.
I understand extinction becomes irreversible at some point. What is the tipping point for humans?
Ooh. I don't know. I don't know what the tipping point for humans is, but it's not going to go like this. We talked about wars earlier today. Why are we fighting each other? We are an aggressive species. We don't like to share resources. And the more people on the planet, the more we're going to fight each other. So we've always fought each other with the limited means we had. But it was over resources. It's always over resources. So, they're projecting that we can have 11 billion people on the planet. I don't think so. We can't sustain what we have right now. So the tipping point for humans, we're playing with it. We're playing with it right now. If climate change goes crazy and wipes out everything, we're done. So yeah.
Okay, here's one from one of our online participants. Can golf courses contribute to the solution, and how?
Yes, they can. They have to be managed properly. So first of all, you've got all the grass that has to be, particularly the putting greens. They've got to be putting greens. That's not where you're going to do conservation. But golf courses almost always own a lot of property, a lot of acreage. You've got the rough, you've got the trees around the golf course. So there's lots of opportunities to make them a lot greener than they are right now. Make sure the trees are important native trees. Make them keystone species. That would be great. Make sure the rough is all native plants. That's a meadow. It's a meadow situation. So there are lots of things you can do, and of course minimize the unnecessary use of pesticides. We traditionally have sprayed golf courses just like we do our lawns with insecticides, even if you have no insect issues. So we've got to stop that. But there are opportunities.
This person has another online person. I have a property with a large lawn, but not a fancy one. It has a lot of clover, plantain, dandelions, wild thyme, etc., but it still gets mowed. Is this more value to this? Is this more value to this type of lawn rather than a single type of grass?
Yes, it is, especially if you let the clover and the dandelions and the other things actually bloom. Clover will bloom even when it's very short, mowing it occasionally. But lift the mower up, make sure it's no lower than 2 inches high. It'll bloom pretty much continuously. It's an important resource for generalist bees like honeybees and bumblebees throughout the summer, really, that you won't have if you use weed and feed. You know, that's got a broadleaf herbicide in it that kills anything except grass. So you have to change your aesthetic values a little bit. When I grew up, that's the way lawns were. All the lawns had clover in them. It wasn't till marketing told us that we were communists if we did that, you know. So yes, you can have more productivity that way. It'd be better though to shrink a part of your lawn and make a pollinator garden that is never mowed. So you have blooming plants from April all the way through the end of September, because that's what our native bees need. They need continuous forage. The concept of no-mow May, it really makes no-mow sense, because pollinators need more than 1 month, and if you don't mow a high-quality lawn, you have tall turf grass, which doesn't supply anything for pollinators. So put aside areas for pollinators that are never mowed.
Do any of the following trees support caterpillar species? White pine, Norway, maple, or sweet gum?
White pine, yes, it's in the top 10. Norway maple. Norway maple is an invasive plant. It's a maple from Europe. If you break open, pull off a leaf at the base of the petiole, this little white latex sap comes out, just like milkweeds. That's a really effective defense, and it discourages most of the maple specialists in this country from eating Norway maple, so it's very low on the list. Sweet gum. Sweet gum is a really important plant to many insects, but it doesn't really reach keystone status. It doesn't mean you shouldn't have it. So, for example, if you want Luna moths, you want sweet gum. The eyed pectes. There's a bunch of things that eat sweet gum, but you're talking about, I don't know, maybe 150 species instead of 500 species. So it's a good plant to have.
Okay. What can I do to influence the minds of people who are obstinate in believing that nature and what they do to influence it will not affect them and is not important?
Yeah. Not only will it affect them, it affects everybody else. I talk about our yards not being like Las Vegas. You know, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happens in our yards does not stay in our yards. And this is where people who think they have the right to do whatever they want on their property are wrong. Does my neighbor have the right to destroy my watershed? Does my neighbor have the right to destroy the pollinator communities that I need for the plants on my property? To destroy my food web, to not sequester carbon? No, they don't. And people don't realize that. So, you know, if we're fooling around with the tipping point, your neighbor can get there and say, uh-oh, I was wrong. That's too late. So I don't know. Education, incentives. If we change the tax incentives, so you actually get a tax break for having less lawn or having keystone plants or something, that changes minds real quickly. So maybe we can fool with that. Incentives work so much better than penalties.
And bring them to your talk. That's the best thing. Okay. Do we need different plants in different states? What about oaks in California or Maine, etc.? Flowers also.
Yes, plants are regionally specialized. There are about 30 species of oaks in California, but they are Californian oaks. We actually did a study. We compared insect use of red oaks, northern red oaks in Portland, Oregon versus Newark, Delaware. You know, top tree in New York, Delaware. Lots of things are using it. Nothing used it in Portland, Oregon. It's the same species, but it's moved totally outside of the community in which with which it co-evolved. So yes, we can use oaks from around the country, but they have to be used locally. And that's true for all of the plants. Which is why, and I didn't tell you about the Native Plant Finder. It's a tool on the National Wildlife Federation website that you can go to and put in your zip code, and the ranked list, the best plants in your county. The best woody plants and herbaceous plants will pop up. So that takes care of that regionalism. You get to see which plant genera are best where you live.
Yes, the researchers have done a lot of work to help us. What nation?
Native Plant Finder on the National Wildlife Federation website.
Sometimes the future of my life on our earth seems bleak. Where do you find your hope and energy? What suggestions do you have to constant climate doom?
I get my hope. Sometimes I get a little depressed too, but like this morning. I get it from the response of people like you. There's more and more interest. I've been talking about this for 20 years, and I see the interest going straight up. So that's motivational. And I also get to see what happened at our house. I mean, we really started with pretty much a blank slate, and it works. That's motivational. I am still getting, 3 nights ago, I got 3 new species of moths that have just come to our house. They're still colonizing this. So it's a very powerful tool, and that makes me want to tell people that. So that's what encourages me.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, my sister, she's been doing a lot on her own lawn, and she sees the moths coming, the pollinators. She's so excited about it.
I am.
You have a question?
I want to say something. Yeah. Can I have a mic?
Brief, okay.
Brief. I just want to tell the story of Doug Tallamy. We saw him I'm from Philadelphia. We saw you at Marriott Tribute House about 2 years ago, a year and a half. And I was so excited by your talk. I had no idea about the lawns and how, each one of us can do something about it. We just reduce our lawns and plant native species. So I went ahead and did that. I contacted a horticulturalist in our area. I told her what I wanted to do. I'm a boomer. I just retired. Got time on my hands, so let's do something. So got planted a yard in our front pollinator with bee balm, penstemon, purple sedum, native hydrangea, native geranium. It's incredibly beautiful, and right away when we planted it, bees started coming. We hadn't even had it in the ground yet, and the bees were there. I have my lady friends over, and some of them are not gardeners, and one just gave me, what a wonderful garden you have in your front. I said, yeah, native species. She said, what? So I just keep spreading the word as much as I can, and I told my brother, who is a biologist and conservationist and et cetera, and I said, you have to invite Doug Tallamy. And so here we are. Yeah.
Thank you, Nancy. Yes, she made this possible. She's the beginning. Thank you. My sister from Philadelphia, my youngest sister. Thank you. And the one I love the most, of course. What do you think about the victory gardens from the world wars and creating an edible garden?
Yeah, gardening, local farming, gardening at home for food is a great idea. It eliminates transportation costs. You get to control what's on your plants. It's just, you just don't do that to save biodiversity. So there's human food and there's everything else. There's a little bit of overlap. You can grow pawpaws, you can grow hickory nuts and persimmons, a few things like that. But the foundational crops that keep us alive, the corn and the soybeans and all the other things, they're not going to support the biodiversity. So having a home garden with vegetables and everything else is a wonderful thing. It's just something else.
Here's an HOA question I'm sure you like. They mandate a weed-free lawn, or you get fined. What should you do?
I don't know if you saw the headline in the New York Times several months ago, I fought the lawn, but the lawn lost. That's a couple in Maryland that sued their HOA and said, oh no, you can't tell me this, and they won. So there's now a legal precedence. HOAs know that. But then you're moving directly into the realm of conflict. So it is much better to learn how to make a productive yard that does not bother the rules of your HOA. Your HOA is afraid that if you use native plants, it's going to reduce property values. That's nonsense, but what they're picturing is no landscaping at all. Everything just goes crazy. So you have to show them that's not what we're talking about. This is where you use lawn as a cue for care. So 1 or 2 mowers widths of lawn along the sidewalk or the driveway, around the beds that you've put in, shows, I've got lawn and I mow it, it's manicured, everything's great, and they won't mind. The bed you put in behind it, that's a flower bed. So that's okay, you're allowed to have a flower bed. So doing it in a tasteful way, particularly in the front yard, is a way to avoid all that conflict.
I have a question. How have you seen lesser celandine controlled? What is the best thing to do?
Short answer, I have not. It's a tough one. It's another tough one. It's a beautiful yellow flower in the spring. That's how it got here. We sold it as an ornamental. Likes wetlands, has tiny little bulbs, almost impossible to weed out. You can spray it and kill everything in your wetland. Probably not a good idea. What does happen is it blooms and then it dies back. And other plants do come up through it. So it looks like it is blanketing an area for a time being, but it's not excluding everything else. So I'm not promoting it by any stretch, but getting rid of it is, if somebody else knows a way to do it, let me know. But if you don't get rid of it, you're not going to have a biological dead zone.
Are there any other questions anyone has? Come on up, Louis, or do you think you have a big enough voice to yell? Louis Johnson, he's a landscaper, so maybe he has a good question for us.
Hello, everyone. In Montgomery County, the park system there has a program called Weed Warriors, and they give training to volunteers, and they teach them in 1 or 2 hours. They teach them which plants are non-native invasive species, which come from other countries and other continents, and they go out from time to time in groups and pull those things out and kill those non-native invasive species. Check with your county. You probably have a similar program. Thank you.
Yes, we have. We do have them here. Maxine and I have worked with the Weed Warriors, yes. You have a question? Come on up. Yeah. State your name.
Hi, I'm Alex Bradford. I wanted to know if you're excited about the law that was just recently passed for banning invasive sale in October. It's going to go through in October. And if you think that that's like a stopping point for that section, or if you think there are next steps like legally, because as we learned from the man who spoke this morning, like we should be attending government meetings, and I want to know what I should be advocating for.
Okay, a couple of questions there. Am I excited about it? Yes, but I just heard about it this morning. So I've only been excited for a short period of time. But it's definitely moving in the right direction. It is ridiculous to be selling invasive plants and then asking people to get rid of them. By the way, I didn't mention one of the major interactive causes of our invasive species problem is too many deer. The deer eat the natives, they don't eat the invasives, and it tips the competitive balance against our natives. So we think these invasive plants are super plants. They're not. They just are unpalatable to the deer, and that's why you have an understory of all, privet and burning bush and barberry and all the things the deer don't touch. What should we be advocating for? Boy, that's a good question. I have to think about it. There's so many things. I would really like to push the incentive part of conservation. I'd love to see the Endangered Species Act rewritten with carrots rather than sticks. Right now, if you have an endangered species on your property and you use your property, you get fined. I'd rather have you paid to be a good steward of that endangered species on your property. And then everybody would want one, and it wouldn't be a problem anymore. I don't know. I guess tamp down the impact of HOAs and civic associations. Definitely work against township level mosquito fogging, where you don't even have a choice. They just go down the street and fog everything. You know, all kinds of bad things about that. So that'll keep you busy.
I've heard that Pennsylvania has banned the calorie pair recently, and Ohio and different states. Do you know what the status here in Maryland is?
Well, it's that rule that was just passed. Yeah, it's not going to be for sale anymore. Of course, you know, it's a great first step. The cat is out of the bag, though. The horse is out of the barn, whatever. We've already got the calorie pairs. They're already spreading like crazy, so feel free to cut them down.
Everybody go out and buy a chainsaw and just cut them down. How does an insect find a new sustainable garden?
Insects find their host plants through smell, through their antennae. Plants put up a perfume. I'll call it a perfume instead of an odor. So the insects are flying around, and there's this matrix of odors out there, and they just keep keying in until they find the one that fits them. It's a real good question, because we've got hundreds of types of plants out there, and yet the insect can identify its particular plant. Like the Canadian owlet finding my little patch of meadow. And I mean little patch. You know, it wasn't as big as that table. But wherever they came from, they found it. So that's another good thing. Insects are really good at finding their host plant and getting a new population going. But you have to give them their host plant.
Okay, any other questions? Any of our partners? How about Sarah?
Do you have a list somewhere of? Okay. Hi, I'm Sarah Niebel with Scenic Rivers Land Trust. So you were talking about the list of what host species and insect species. Do you have it on your homegrown national park website on where we could find what NMAs need what plants? Or is it?
Well, the list I was talking about was it's the Native Plant Finder and the National Wildlife Federation website, and we do refer to it on homegrown. But what it does is it says, okay, oaks in this area support this many species. You can go backwards. You can say, what does tiger swallowtail eat here? And it will tell you what it eats. There is not a complete list of all of the species on a particular plant genus, except in my lab. And yes, we are going to publish that. My helper, Kimberly Shrupshire, has been working on that for years. But she's ranking all the plant genera in the world, and she wants to finish that first. But she's getting close. She's getting close. So I would say within the next year, that will be a giant Excel file that you can go to.
Okay. Well, if there's no more questions, we have Allison here.
Hi, I just want to give a shout out to the Repollinate program at the Watershed Stewards Academy. It's at the Patuxent Refuge. And many of you know the name Sam Droege. He is a beast scientist there. And we have a program where if you spend a little bit of time to help seed the plants in the season, once they're grown, these are all native species, you will get the plants and they will be free. It's just, and you'll go there and you'll help to plant the seeds and then repot them and watch them grow, but then you'll have many native plants, and it's a wonderful way to meet people, like-minded people, and to learn about native plants. The last thing, I just for the labels, when we are now going to the stores to buy plants, if we had a label that said host plant, then many more people would be interested in buying them. Like this supports 557. Right? We'd all buy oaks.
Allison, where is that place where they're growing the natives?
It's the
Patuxent.
You need to go to the Watershed Stewards Academy website, the Anne Arundel County Watershed Stewards Academy, and look up Repollinate.
Thank you. Any other final words from Professor?
Personal responsibility. You all have a responsibility, and you're here. You're already exercising your responsibility. But talk to that neighbor who's not here. It is their responsibility to take care of their world.
Thank you very much, Dr. Douglas Tallamy. Thank you for coming and for your wonderful answers to all of our questions.